are so many Pride and Prejudice adaptations, from film versions to musicals to web series. It's a story that has been told time and time again in varying time periods and situations. There's something universal within the pages of the story, and not just a universal truth that wealthy men must be in want of a wife. However, along with the more creative adaptations that breathe new life into the classic, there are also some true failures. I recently found one of these duds while doing a bit of research for an upcoming video on Pride and Prejudice and zombies, which is also a bit of a miss, but for very different reasons. Unleashing Mr. Darcy, a Hallmark film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, is guilty of many crimes. One of them being naming this man Mr. Bingley.
Meet Mr. Bingley.
But giving this man all the parts and personality of the classic character. Why would you call this man, who's playing the Mr. Bingley part, Henry, and not Charles? Or at least Charlie? I'm still trying to figure it out. The film does nothing to utilize its dog show setting, other than accessorizing the story with cute puppies, which, to be fair, are very cute, but the setting certainly could have been used as an easy setup for tension. A true underdog story, as the unpedigreed Elizabeth deals with the uppity dog show people. Oh well. I guess puppies are cute. It skips around the plot of Pride and Prejudice willy-nilly, like it doesn't recognize why the plot is structured the way it is. It's not like it's one of the most well-respected novels of all time or anything. Also, the title is weird. Yes, it's a dog pun, sort of, but the title seems directly ripped from a cheesy romance Oh. Well, that makes sense. However, for all of its faults, and there are numerous, there's one thing that it fails at harder than anything else. It fails to recognize what Pride and Prejudice is really about. Unleashing Mr. Darcy is a bad adaptation of Pride and Prejudice because it fails to show what made the original great in the first place. It fails to recognize why Pride and Prejudice isn't just a cheesy romance novel, but deserves its marker as a piece of classic literature. It's a love story, yes, but it's also a love-yourself story. So with that being said, let's deconstruct what the differences between the two pieces of media are to better understand how the adaptation misses the mark.
It's Elizabeth Scott.
The first thing that it fails to understand is the character of Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth Bennet is one of the greatest heroines in English literature for a reason. She's headstrong, intelligent, confident, and a woman ahead of her time.
Elizabeth Bennet was way ahead of her time.
I singled you out as the companion of my future life.
Sir, I cannot accept you.
Elizabeth symbolizes a woman who has finally embraced the idea of her own worth and the worth of the people around her. She values her sister so highly because Jane is kinder than Elizabeth could hope to be. Her father is beloved to her because of his high intelligence and never-ending curiosity. Charlotte is a confidant that Lizzie doesn't feel the need to put on airs with. However, it also means that Lizzie is rather harsh upon the people she doesn't find worth in. Her mother's twittering bothers her, Lydia and Kitty are insufferable because of their vanity and love of social engagements, and perhaps, worst of all, Darcy is an arrogant rich man with little regard for those poorer than him. She's infinitely complicated, but also so relatably simple. She has good qualities and flaws that are explored through her journey. The fact that Pride and Prejudice is an exploration of how Lizzie's idea of her best quality actually ends up being one of her worst, her judgments of people's character, is poetic. It shows that her judgments are not always infallible. Scenes with characters like Wickham, Charlotte, and of course Darcy show Lizzie's inherent prejudices against those who value societal norms or the wealthy. In the end, her marriage to Darcy is not just symbolic of her love for him, but a symbol of her growth as a person. She loves him, yes, but in her growth as a person, she can love him. So in what way does Unleashing Mr. Darcy truly not understand this character arc? To start this character arc, the reader must first of all like the protagonist. They have to like them as a person to root for them to change. For all of Lizzie Bennet's faults, the readers love her. When we read that Lizzie trekked through miles of countryside to be by her 6 sisters' side, even though she knew she would arrive unpresentable to the homeowners, the readers see her value. We root for her to become the best version of herself. Elizabeth Scott is not likable. She has no real moments that endear the reader to her as a person. She has a sister, and we're meant to imply that they are as close as Jane and Lizzie in the books, but we're never shown that bond. Her sister sacrifices for her, but not the other way around. She is a school teacher, but there's no real connection with her students. She has no real wit to recommend her to us either.
It's like he's the king and I'm the tiny little minion.
I'm sure that's exactly how he is.
Nor any kind of rebelling against the system that made the scenes with Lady Catherine so much fun in the original. However, worse than being unlikable, Elizabeth Scott has no real character arc. She starts the story valuing her own opinion above all others, and honestly, the story seems to support her every opinion. Everyone she judges as a bad person is a bad person, and everyone she judges as a good person is a good person. Except for Darcy, who, surprise, surprise, is the most wonderful man ever created without any real flaws whatsoever. But we'll come back to that character assassination. Elizabeth Scott learns nothing by not being wrong. In fact, the whole side story about her dealing with the terrible parent to one of her students doesn't do anything but confirm that Elizabeth Scott doesn't need to change. It takes the complicated character of Elizabeth Bennet and basically takes out any point of complication, leaving a rather boring heroine. We're one very important part of Pride and Prejudice down, if this Lizzie Bennet isn't Lizzie Bennet. Just a side note, it's not that I think Elizabeth Bennet has to be exactly as she is in the book. In fact, a great Pride and Prejudice adaptation, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, certainly adds more goofy humor to Lizzie than classic wit, but she has the same charm as the original. It's just updated. In this society, Lizzie would have more free range to say what she wants, so she does. Not so in Unleashing Mr. Darcy.
You keep surprising me.
You mean I surprise your preconceptions of me?
I'm pretty sure I've already apologized for being too quick to judge.
With that, let's return to the claim that this movie makes, showing Mr. Darcy as the most perfect man alive who can do no wrong. Honestly, if you've never actually read the book or watched the close adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, you might be under the same impression that Unleashing Mr. Darcy is. That the lesson that Elizabeth has to learn is that she's misjudged Fitzwilliam Darcy, thinking him callous and cruel, only to find him without any faults at all. However, if you read the book, or watched any close adaptations, you'll learn the truth. Mr. Darcy is in fact a total jerk in the beginning.
Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your circumstances?
And those are the words of a gentleman.
The whole point to Darcy is that he is just as flawed as Elizabeth. He too believes his own opinions over others and acts on his held opinions. It's this reason that the proposal is such a turning point in the book. When Elizabeth lays out his faults so clearly in front of his face, it's like a slap which wakes Darcy out of his own pride and makes him consider himself through another's eyes. He finds himself wanting and goes about trying his best to remedy his flaws. Seeing his flaws reflected in Elizabeth Bennet spurs his change. It's why in the end we can love Mr. Darcy, who truly changed to be the best version of himself because of Elizabeth. I can see where someone would argue that Darcy doesn't acknowledge his flaws. He simply offers excuses for why Elizabeth might see his actions in a negative light. However, I would argue that his concentrated effort to recover Lydia, with her honor intact, is not necessarily just to redeem himself in Elizabeth's eyes, but to make up for his prideful silence which led to the incident in the first place. He knows that it was his judgment which led to Jane as well as Bingley's unhappiness, so he fixes it. Darcy sees how Elizabeth is right about him and takes action to fix it. Donovan Darcy does not. Which again, another weird name change for seemingly no reason. I mean, I can see changing the name Fitzwilliam to William, but why Donovan? Is it just a sexier name? It sounds more like a Bond villain to me. Back to the topic at hand though. Donovan Darcy has an excuse for every negative personality trait he has. He makes some rude comments to Elizabeth, but it's just because he's so dedicated to his dog show craft or embarrassed about his feelings for her. He's too serious about certain events he hosts and snobs around with the stuck-up, wealthy elite, but that's only because it's for the multitude of charities which he supports. It's true that in the book we see that Darcy cares deeply about his sister, and the film has that parallel correct. However, when heaped on with his other glowing qualities, instead of all the bad ones we had come to associate with Darcy in the book, it loses its impact. The moment where Elizabeth shows Donovan his flaws is played out so melodramatically that it's clear that Elizabeth is being unfair to Donovan. In fact, in the wake of all his multitude of amazing qualities, it seems almost ridiculous that Elizabeth behaves the way she does, instead of justified.
You look furious. What did he say? He had the nerve to tell me that he's in love with me.
His actions after that point, like getting Elizabeth's job back for her and bringing Henry and Jane back together, are not, as they were for Darcy, a wake-up call, but instead are a way to prove his love. The film takes the complicated redemption arc of a man who realizes what kind of person he's become and is making a concentrated effort to change, and turns it into a simple case of playful misunderstanding. Pride and Prejudice is as much about Darcy's arc as it is about Elizabeth's. In fact, in seeing their own flaws in the other person and learning to love that person, they learn to love themselves. If the two don't go on this journey together, the whole point of the novel is lost. Apart from the characters, there is also a blatant misunderstanding of the class commentary that Pride and Prejudice was trying to make, in that Pride and Prejudice wasn't trying to make any class commentary. Now, that might strike Austen fans as odd. Of course Pride and Prejudice was making class commentary. Didn't you read about everyone's income and the side plot about the Bennets' financial problems? And yes, Pride and Prejudice is set with the background of the interactions between people from different class structures, but the novel is much more about dispelling the inherent stereotypes associated with people of certain classes, rather than making commentary on whether the class structure is right or wrong. Just because Wickham comes from the poor class does not mean he's inherently moral, as so many novels of the time paint the destitute. And similarly, Darcy, who is ridiculously rich, is not necessarily the devil incarnate. However, on the flip side, Jane, from a lower class, is the most gentle soul you could ever meet, and Miss Bingley is a very privileged woman with a mean streak. Their station in society is not a recommendation or condemnation to their character. There are no exceptions to their class, just people as varied as people are. There are enough characters so widely varied to support Austen's thesis in the book. However, when watching Unleashing Mr. Darcy, it was pretty clear that Darcy and Henry are the exceptions to their rich class. The rich class as a whole are evil, except for these two who happen to be the love interests. There's no Wickham. Well, I suppose the evil parent from the school functions as a Wickham character, but not once does Elizabeth think kindly of that character. He's always maniacally twisting his mustache in the corner, so the reveal of Wickham as a less than savory character has no real impact. Also, he's rich. They take out any lower class character who might be less than nice to make the commentary that people with privilege are inherently evil. In fact, Lady Catherine is framed way more like an evil stepmother in this film than her presence in the book. Lady Catherine in the book is antagonistic, and yes, she is very aware of her higher status, but she's also a reflection of Lizzie's own arrogance. Lady Catherine is the head of her household. She holds a lot of power and thus believes her own opinions are facts. This is why Lizzie and Lady Catherine collide against one another, not because they are so different, but because they are so similar. Lady Catherine is not the evil stepmother to Elizabeth's Cinderella. She's what Lizzie could become if her opinions had been backed up by wealth. In this Hallmark movie, the film goes out of its way to frame whatever her name is, it's not Catherine, that I know, as this conniving villain instead of a meddling rich old lady.
How you can show your face here is beyond me.
Once again making the commentary that rich people are evil, which is nowhere to be found in the novel. It's much more complicated than that. Or possibly more simple. People are people. Their upbringing may explain some of their nature, but it doesn't explain everything. They also have their own nature. Now, a little side tangent that I couldn't find a place for.
And now for something completely different.
What's with changing the names? There seems to be no rhyme or reason for it. Yes, the book it's based on apparently has these names and not the Pride and Prejudice names, but that still leaves my question. Why? Originally, I thought it was possible that the copyright on Jane Austen's novel is still in effect, meaning the movie and book couldn't use the names for legal reasons. However, after some more research for an upcoming video about Pride and Prejudice and zombies, the copyright has long since expired. In fact, since they were written in 1813, the novels have basically been in the public domain since then. The only other reason I could think for changing the names would be to disguise certain characters. If you call a character Wickham, every reader now knows his path. So if the author wants to keep the character identity a secret or play on readers' expectations, the names would have to change. However, there's no tricky switch in this adaptation. It's quite clear which characters are which, except for I suppose the addition of a Mr. Bingley who shows up for one scene and never returns. I understand wanting to update the names from the Regency period, but honestly, most of the names are so generic they would hardly be out of place in a modern setting. Which leaves the last and most offensive reasoning for the name change. The author and creators are essentially using an out against criticism that might call the adaptation less than faithful. The names are different, so the characters are different. We're merely suggesting the Pride and Prejudice connection, but this is a wholly original story. If that is the reason, let me commend the creators for thinking ahead to this kind of criticism, which honestly I would never expect a Hallmark movie to get. But assure them that merely changing the names doesn't make the story original. There's enough cribbed from the novel, even if it's not used properly, to show that the creators were going for a modern adaptation. So nice try to all. Overall, I would recommend checking out the many other great adaptations to Pride and Prejudice that add new levels to the original instead of this. Sure, I don't expect much from a Hallmark movie, but it's a little hard to forgive this one when the structure for a great story is literally yours for the taking. I even think that it might have worked had the creators actually analyzed their source material. However, as it stands now, I wouldn't throw this dog a bone.